New Problems, New Solutions by Kristen Kishore. Moving to the cities. The United States grew all through the 1800s. However, in the late 1800s, while the number of people continued to increase, where and how people lived began to change too. During its early history, the United States was largely a rural agricultural nation. Most Americans, at least 85% of them, lived on farms or in rural communities near those farms in 1850. Farms were small, and most people could only raise enough food for themselves. It took a lot of work, and a lot of workers, to raise enough crops to provide food for nearby towns. In the late 1800s, people who had lived in the country all their lives started moving to the city. This move from rural areas to cities, or urbanization, would change the United States dramatically. The country was becoming a nation of city dwellers. People from rural areas were moving to the cities to find jobs. In the 1800s, mechanization had revolutionized farming. Machines now did much of the work that people once did by hand. Mechanical plows, reapers, and milking machines made it unnecessary for farmers to hire so many workers. Farmers could plant many more acres and milk more cows with fewer people to help. They could now feed far more people than ever before. This meant that there were suddenly a lot of farm workers without jobs. Cities were where jobs could be found. Factories were hiring hundreds of workers, and the growing populations needed services, from selling groceries to making clothes to sweeping streets. People in other countries also heard about the jobs in America's cities. Between 1890 and 1910, more than 10 million immigrants flooded into the country. Never before had so many come to the United States in such a short period of time. This burst of immigration contributed further to the rapid growth of the cities. Unfortunately, there were not enough jobs for everyone. Immigrants were often willing to work for lower wages, which meant they took jobs away from American workers. This angered many workers. Labor organizations and other groups often tried to keep immigrants from entering the country. The Know Nothing Party was powerful in American politics in the early 1850s. This group protested angrily against cheap labor from other countries. Job shortages and protesters were not the only problems in the cities. People would soon have to face a wide range of issues as populations continued to grow. Opportunity and hardship. The United States was seen as the land of promise. Because of increased opportunities, many poor people, both Americans and immigrants, improved their lives during this period. They worked hard, and many succeeded. Some even became very wealthy. With more people earning and spending money, more opportunities opened up. America became the most productive nation in the world. However, not every story was a success story, and people faced growing problems created by the increasing size of the cities. Many immigrants and rural poor who had come to the city worked endlessly but could not escape poverty. A lack of skills or education trapped many in low-paying jobs. As more people arrived, housing became difficult to find. Buildings were divided into smaller and smaller apartments, and large families often crowded into these tiny tenements. New tenement buildings were built rapidly as the need for housing continued to increase. Some were badly constructed, some lacked heat, and some even lacked windows. Cities were growing so fast that there were few services in place to take care of such things as garbage removal. Soon, streets and rivers were filthy and unsafe. There were also few parks and few places children could play, and there were not enough police or firefighters. The cities were becoming dangerous. Because so many people were living so closely together, diseases spread quickly. The tenement buildings were the worst places, but disease soon affected everyone. Epidemics, or rapid spreading, of polio, tuberculosis, smallpox, cholera, and typhoid fever killed thousands of people. In the South, thousands died from yellow fever. Influenza killed over 500,000 Americans in 1918. Clearly, something had to be done. Help is on the way. Individuals, organizations, and city and federal governments worked hard trying to solve the problems. Organizations such as the YMCA, YWCA, and the Salvation Army, still well known today, got started during this time. Immigrants who had succeeded offered help to others coming from their respective homelands. The idea of public health was introduced. City governments began cleaning up the streets. In 1870, Congress created a national health agency. New immigrants arriving in the late 1800s were checked for contagious diseases. Authorities treated those who were sick before letting them move into the cities. In New York City, Dr. Joseph Kinyoun set up a laboratory in 1887 so he could study the contagious diseases that were killing so many people. In 1891, Kinyoun moved his laboratory to Washington, D.C. Congress funded research in new facilities, and in time, the small laboratory grew into the National Institutes of Health. Jane Addams started her famous settlement house, Hull House, in Chicago in 1889. Many people admired her efforts to help poor immigrants and imitated her work. In 1890, Jacob Riis, an immigrant from Denmark, published a book of photographs titled How the Other Half Lives. The book's shocking pictures of the urban poor had a powerful effect. The work of Riis and other reformers resulted in New York State's Tenement House Act of 1901. This law required much stronger safety and health standards for tenements. Political machines are created. Improvements were being made, but cities still needed better streets, more housing, and better sewage disposal. Because of workers who worried that immigrants were taking jobs away from Americans, immigrants often needed help finding jobs. City governments struggled to meet these needs, but change was not happening as fast as the cities were growing. Some people took advantage of the situation, and political machines were formed. A political machine is an organization of people who control votes to gain political power. Members of the political machines wanted to get candidates they had chosen elected to city offices, so they promised immigrants that they would help them if the immigrants would vote for the candidates the political machine had chosen. Once elected, the machine-picked candidates did what the political machine told them to do. They helped other members of their political machine gain power and wealth. A powerful political machine in New York City was Tammany Hall. Perhaps the most famous Tammany leader was Boss William M. Tweed. He was known for bribing leaders and cheating people out of money. However, when he stole millions of dollars from the city, he finally went to jail. Political machines also arose in Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and other cities. Although most political machines were dishonest and influenced by bribes, many immigrants wanted their help. They were glad that someone seemed to be taking their side. And some political machines did work to improve things. They may have hired only members of the political machine or accepted bribes for contracts, but streets did get built, services were expanded, and jobs were created. But these things happened more slowly and at greater cost because of the corruption of the political machines. Too many people, too little space. Efforts were being made to improve health and education. Many people were working to make life better for the poor and to create cleaner, prettier cities. But cities were still running out of space. People needed more than buildings to live in. They needed water, sewers, and garbage collection. They needed stores, doctors, and post offices. Cities had a limited amount of land on which to build. As urban populations increased, space became a real problem. What could be done? Moving up, moving out. Two things came together to help cities create more space. The first was the invention of the safety elevator. Elevators were not new, but initially there was no way to stop them if they fell. So elevators were used to move products, not people. Then Elisha Graves Otis invented a braking system for elevators. If the elevator cable broke, his system would grip the tracks on either side of the elevator, bringing the elevator to a stop. People could now ride safely. Otis installed the first passenger elevator in a 5-story department store in New York City in 1857. The second part of the solution was affordable steel. The Bessemer process for producing steel had been brought to the United States by Andrew Carnegie in the 1870s, so good steel was suddenly widely available. A building supported by a steel frame could grow very tall. Steel and elevators made it possible to build taller buildings. A city could now expand upward. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed Chicago's downtown area, so Chicago seemed like a good place to start experimenting with taller buildings or skyscrapers. The first skyscraper, the Home Insurance Building, was completed in Chicago in 1885. At 10 stories tall, it was the tallest building in the country. Taller buildings were soon being constructed. Rivers posed another problem. Being near water transportation was a key reason for the location of many big cities. Many cities had rivers running either through or alongside them. It was hard to build bridges without making it even harder to use the river. Suspension bridges, bridges that are suspended or hung from massive overhead cables, were a relatively new idea. It was a challenge to create stable, strong suspension bridges that could survive heavy traffic. John Roebling, a German immigrant and building engineer, solved the problem by combining new building methods with a strong steel cable he had developed. After he built the first successful steel suspension bridges, New York State asked him to design the Brooklyn Bridge. Sadly, he died before this bridge was completed. His son, Washington, finished the bridge. After he became ill, Washington was assisted in his work by his wife, Emily. When it opened in 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was the longest bridge in the world. Cities also began to create new forms of public transportation. Some cities built elevated trains that were supported by steel structures that held them 1 or 2 stories above street level. New York's elevated train opened in 1870 and Chicago's in 1892. Next, engineers began to consider going down, under the streets. Many cities began experimenting with this idea, but it was Boston, Massachusetts that, in 1897, opened the country's first successful underground train system, or subway. The late 1800s through early 1900s was the period that gave us much of what we consider normal for big cities today, from traffic jams to skyscrapers to subways. And today, city governments still struggle to keep up with city growth, and immigrants continue to arrive looking for opportunities.